Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. This is the first webinar in our series this spring, and we're excited to have you with us. My name's Amy Perkins, and I am the Marketing Manager for Early Childhood Assessment Tools here at Brooks Publishing. This webinar is on assessing literacy practices with the Early Language and Literacy Classroom Observation, or the ELLCO for short, and Louisa Anastasopoulos, one of the ELLCO developers, is going to share a presentation about the tool. But first, I'd like to go over some housekeeping tasks. So you'll be muted for the webinar, but if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar panel bar, or you can tweet them using hashtag #TalkAboutTools. We'll take these questions after Louisa's presentation during the Q&A portion of the webinar. For best audio and screen quality, you may want to exit any unneeded programs like your email or other browsers. For the presentation, you might also want to minimize the GoToWebinar control bar that you see on your monitor. That way you'll be able to see more of your screen. You can do that by clicking the orange button with the arrow in the top corner of the control bar. And if you need to enlarge that again to ask a question, you can just click that orange button and the control panel will pop back out. Also, we're recording this webinar, and you'll receive a link to the recording in a follow-up email tomorrow. And we'll also post a link to the recording on the Brooks Publishing website. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Louisa has extensive experience conducting classroom observations, child assessments, and interviews with teachers and parents. Her work has dealt with examinations of classroom quality, as well as with early language and literacy. She has been instrumental in the design of teacher and parent interview protocols, and has spent a great deal of time interacting with preschool teachers and staff. Her bilingual expertise has contributed to her ability to work with a wide variety of teachers and parents. Louisa holds a Master of Public Policy with a focus on education policy from the Georgetown Public Policy Institute. So thank you, Louisa, for joining us. And now I'm going to turn it over to you for the presentation.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you to Brooks Publishing for inviting me to come and do this webinar. This is very exciting for me to be able to reach such a broad audience to talk about the ELLCO. As Amy mentioned, my name is Louisa Anastasopoulos. I'm a Senior Research Associate at Education Development Center, which is a nonprofit research and development company in Waltham, Massachusetts, and as she mentioned, I'm one of the authors of the ELLCO. So my goal for today is really just to give you a basic overview of the structure and uses of the ELLCO Pre-K. Before I do that, what I'd really like to do is get an idea of who you are, because one of the benefits of a webinar is being able to reach a broad audience, but one of the obvious downsides is that I can't see and interact with you in person. So I'd really like to find out from the audience a little bit about you. So I'm hoping you can take this poll that Amy is helping us do right now. So it's just a poll about what your professional role is. So the options are program director, classroom teacher, researcher, consultant, or other. And I am going to have Amy take over to instruct you in how to complete the poll.
Okay, so I think I'm seeing submissions come in, so I think everyone's seeing the poll. We have about, I think, almost 70% of the people who have answered it. So we'll give you a couple more seconds there to answer. Louisa, are you seeing the, actually I'll close the poll. We're almost to full capacity. All right, I'm going to close the poll and then I'm going to share it so that everyone will be able to see the results
Great.
on their screen. So let's see. So Louisa, do you see those? Or do you want me to read them off to you?
Let me see if I can. I don't see them.
Okay, so we have, 8% are classroom teachers, 33% are researchers, 8% are consultants, and 50% are other. So we have quite a bit of other.
A lot of other. Okay. Okay, good to know. So that's helpful just to get a sense of who's in the audience somewhat. Thank you, Amy, for your help with that.
No problem.
What I'd like to do is just take a moment to talk a little bit about the ELLCO suite of tools, because there actually is more than one tool that goes by the name ELLCO. All of the tools are designed to assess literacy environments and instruction, and all published by Brooks. Today's topic is the ELLCO Pre-K, which looks specifically at pre-K classrooms. There's also an ELLCO for K to 3 classrooms that was developed here at Education Development Center. And finally, there's something called the CELLO, which stands for Child Home Early Language and Literacy Observation Tool, which was developed by Susan Newman and is designed to be used in home-based childcare settings. So for those of you wondering if the ELLCO Pre-K is appropriate for your environment, there are these other tools that sometimes people have questions about. So today we will be focusing on the pre-K version for use in pre-K classrooms, but there are these other tools that are designed to be used in different settings. In terms of audience, the ELLCO has been used and is appropriate for use both for professional development as well as for research and evaluation. There are entire chapters devoted to each of these audiences in the ELLCO Pre-K User's Guide, but as I talk today, I will try my best to address the different concerns that each of these groups might have in terms of the tool and how it's used. The ELLCO Pre-K is a research-based observation. It is based on what research tells us about literacy development and best practices in early literacy. For example, the fact that language and literacy development begins at birth and develops through interaction. Things like the fact that vocabulary development and language skills are related to later school success. The importance of interactive book reading as well as print-rich environments in building language and literacy skills. All of these things that are now widely accepted as best practice in early childhood, but are really research-based findings, and that is what the ELLCO tool is based on. And so in terms of implications of the research, what's really important? What matters in pre-K classrooms? Well, what the research tells us is that classroom structure matters. The layout of the classroom, the contents, how time is used, as well as staffing. That curriculum matters. The content, again, of the curriculum, whether or not children can make choices in terms of what they're engaged in, as well as the integration of language and literacy throughout the curriculum. That certainly language matters, the frequency of conversations, the content of those conversations, as well as the vocabulary and phonological awareness. That books and book reading certainly matter, the presence of books, children's access to those books, the content and use of those books. And likewise, that print and writing matter. Presence of print in the classroom, the access to print and writing materials for children, and how those materials are used. And because all of these things, research tells us that all of these things are important, that's exactly what was used to structure the ELLCO Pre-K. So you'll see here that there are 2 main subscales, the general classroom environment subscale, which includes items related to classroom structure and curriculum, and the language and literacy subscale, which has items related to the language environment, books and book reading, and print and early writing. So within these 5 sections, there are a total of 19 items that make up the ELLCO Pre-K. We're going to look at each of these in a moment, but what I'd like to first do is to again get some more information from you in the audience about how familiar you are with the tool already. So you'll see there is, on your control panel, there is a yellow hand that's inside of a blue circle. That's the raise your hand symbol. So what I'd like to do is get just an idea from those of you, how many of you have seen or read the ELLCO Pre-K prior to today? And Amy, I may need to call on you to fill me on what responses are, because I can't see that.
Okay. So right now we have 4 people. So the majority of the audience hasn't seen.
Okay.
Hasn't seen or read it.
Okay. And then of those 4 people, I guess, how many of you have actually used the ELLCO before?
It looks like, so we have just a couple
Okay.
of people.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Thanks, Amy.
No problem.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the classroom structure section of the ELLCO. It's made up of 4 items, as I mentioned. The first one is organization of the classroom. This really looks at the furnishings. Are they adequate and appropriate for young children? Is the classroom inviting? Are quiet centers separated from louder and messier areas of the classroom? Then we also look at the contents of the classroom. Are there adequate materials? How are they organized? Are they accessible to children to get to independently? There is an item related to classroom management that looks at whether teachers employ a variety of strategies and methods for communicating classroom expectations, as well as whether children are engaged throughout the day. And we look at personnel in terms of adequate staffing, how do the staff relate with each other, and whether or not they are engaged with children throughout the day. The second section within general classroom environment is curriculum. And here we look at approaches to curriculum. So what is being taught and how is it integrated throughout the classroom? Opportunities for child choice and initiative, whether children are able to make decisions throughout the day about what they're engaged in, as well as recognizing diversity in the classroom. Now moving into the language and literacy subscale, there is a section on the language environment. So first we have discourse climate, as well as opportunities for extended conversation. So these are actually 2 distinct items. The first one, discourse climate, looks at whether efforts are made to engage all children in conversation, whereas opportunities for extended conversations looks at the types of conversations that are actually taking place. Are there multiple turns between teacher and child? Are children allowed ample time to express themselves? This section also includes efforts to build vocabulary as well as phonological awareness. The fourth section deals specifically with books and book reading. There are 5 items within this section. The first is organization of the book area. Again, is the area orderly and inviting? Are there adequate books? And are they organized? What condition are the books in? Then we look specifically at the characteristics of books. What types of books? Is there a range of genres represented, as well as a range of difficulty levels? Then we look at books for learning. This looks specifically at where the books are located throughout the room and how they're used. Approaches to book reading looks at the different configurations in which book reading takes place. Is there one-on-one book reading happening, as well as small group book reading and full group book reading? And then finally, quality of book reading looks at that full group book reading experience in the classroom. Is it engaging? Is it challenging and interactive? The final section is the print and early writing section, and has 3 items. Early writing environment looks at the writing materials, what they are, where they're located, what condition they're in, the variety of them. Support for children's writing looks at how teachers support children's writing efforts. What opportunities are available to children and how do teachers scaffold? And finally, environmental print looks at writing around the room and how it is used by children throughout their day. So that's an overview of the 19 items. Each of these items is rated on a 5-point scale. The highest rating that a classroom could receive on each of these scales is a rating of 5, which is considered exemplary and shows compelling evidence for that particular item. A rating of 4 is considered strong with sufficient evidence. A rating of 3 is considered basic with some evidence. A rating of 2 is considered inadequate with limited evidence. And a rating of 1 is considered deficient with minimal evidence. So if people who are using this tool for research purposes may calculate a total score across the 19 items as well, or take an average for all 19 items as well as for each subscale, and then look for change over time. Whereas if someone who is using the tool for professional development may wish to look at this at an item level and look for areas of strength and areas for improvement in order to have a discussion with a classroom teacher about goal setting, for example. What I'd like to do now is I'm showing you an item from the ELLCO. I'm assuming that most of you do not have the tool in front of you. Some of you haven't seen it before. So this is not for us to read through this item in detail, but just to give you a sense of what each of the items looks like. This is item 1, which is organization of the classroom. So you'll see at the very top there is this blue bar that shows the 5-point scale that I just talked about. And right below that is a green bar with some text in it, and this is what we call the anchor statement. This is the real guiding force behind assigning scores for each item. For this particular item, organization of the classroom, the anchor statement for a score of exemplary says, there is compelling evidence of a physical environment that is well organized for learning. As you move from exemplary to the lower scores, you'll see that the language just changes by one word. So for a score of 4, there is sufficient evidence of a physical environment that is well organized for learning. And as you go down, it changes from sufficient evidence to some evidence for a score of 3, limited evidence for a score of 2, and minimal evidence for a score of 1. Now below the anchor statement you'll see these bulleted statements, and these are what we call descriptive indicators. These bullets are examples of what one might see at each of these scoring levels. So, and it's important to note that the rows, you'll see there are 4 rows here. There are 5 columns, one for each rating point, but there are also 4 rows, and the rows have significance as well because each row addresses a particular aspect of the classroom or instruction. So for this example, organization of the classroom, the top row deals with furnishings. So the example of furnishings at an exemplary level is furnishings are appropriately sized, comfortable for young children, and in good repair. The classroom is welcoming to children and adults, and furnishings are arranged to invite children into varied learning areas. As you read from a score of 5 down to the lower scores, you'll see that this description changes. So for example, at a score of 3, which is considered basic or some evidence, the environment is adequately equipped with child-sized furnishings in generally good repair. And for a score of 1, which is considered deficient, it says, furnishings do not appear to be appropriate for young children and present hazards. So you see that that entire row is devoted to the concept of furnishing, and the description of what that might look like changes as you go from a score of 5 down to a score of 1. Now at this point it's important for me to point out that the ELLCO is designed to be scored holistically. These bullets are examples. It is not like some other observation tools that some of you might be familiar with, such as the ECHRs, where it's a checklist and you have to have a certain number of things checked off in order to receive a certain score. The bullets are examples of what you might see and serve as guidance, but it is often the case that you might see some examples that fall under a score of 5, and just for one of those factors you might see a score of 2. So often people say, well, what am I supposed to do? Do I take the average? And what I always tell people is you always go back to the anchor statement and have that be your guiding source. You collect your evidence, you look at the descriptive indicators, then you look back at the anchor score and say, Is there compelling evidence of a physical environment that is well organized for learning? Or is it a lower bar than that? So it's holistic scoring, and the anchor statement is really, really important. All of this is covered in depth in ELLCO training sessions, so it's not something that I expect. I'm sure that there's probably some confusion about that when I talk about it, but I should reassure you that if you do go through ELLCO training, that is a lot of time is spent on practicing that and talking about how that works. Okay. So in terms of ELLCO Pre-K, it's important to think about who should use the tool and how should it be used. So most importantly, especially because of this idea of holistic scoring, it needs to be used by someone who has early education experience. You can't just take anyone off the street and expect them to be able to use this tool appropriately. Ideally, it would be great if the person using the tool also has observation experience. That's something that can be gained over time using the tool, but it is something that it is a skill that needs to be developed and takes some time to develop. Finally, whoever uses the tool should receive ELLCO training, because it is a complex tool and training is required. So in terms of using the tool, what should be observed and when should all of this take place? So it should, we recommend 3.5 hours of observation time, and the types of activities or times of day that you need to see in order to get a full sense of the day are free choice time, a full group book reading session, mealtime, whether if it's a program that does breakfast and lunch, seeing one or the other of those would be great, as well as greeting or departing, and any other instructional times. So if there are times of day that are set aside for specific instruction, it would be important to observe during those times. And then not quite my parting words of advice, but some almost parting words of advice, is just the importance of really learning the tool before you use it. So I showed you just one of the 19 items, and you saw how much text is on that page. Early childhood classrooms are very busy places with a lot of complex interactions going on. And when you're doing those 3.5 hours of observation, you really need to be focused on what's going on in the classroom and writing notes and taking evidence about what you see. So you can't take time to be reading through the rubrics and learning the tool as you do that. We really encourage people to take the time to read through and learn the ELLCO, to use Post-its to mark off the different sections if they need to be able to flip back and forth quickly, to highlight and circle important passages or important bits of information, but really to learn the tool well before people use it. And then finally, so the ELLCO is published by Brooks, so there's an image of the pre-K and the K-3 tool here. They are offering a discount to webinar participants for ordering, and there's information for those of you who are interested in ELLCO training that is run through Brooks on Location through their program, and their website is listed on this slide. So I encourage those of you who are interested in using the ELLCO to explore the training options that are provided by Brooks. So I know that Amy has a system for taking questions, so I'm going to turn it back over to her.
Great. Thanks, Louisa. That was good information. So if anyone has a question for Louisa about the ELLCO, you can type them into the question box that's on the in the GoToWebinar panel there. And so I do have, there were some questions that were submitted with registration, and then I think we do have a couple questions so far. So Louisa, I'll just read those off to you, okay?
Let me see if I can, yep.
Okay. All right, so how often should the ELLCO be administered for a classroom? Just once a year or multiple times?
I would say it depends on what your purpose is for using the ELLCO. So if you're using it for professional development, then it may be something that you want to just do one time as part of the teacher's performance review. I think there is some power in using it more than once, just to introduce teachers to it, and then to set some goals, and then to maybe use it again to see progress. And then for research purposes, it would depend sort of on your research question. I think typically if people are looking to see changes in classroom instruction, there's usually a pre and a post. So it might be some, a fall and spring observation. So probably in more situations than not, you're probably using it twice a year. But again, it would vary depending on what your purpose is.
Okay, great. That makes sense. Let's see. So we have a question about ELLCO training. The question was about how much the ELLCO trainings are, and I know that kind of varies. So we can answer that question
Okay.
offline. But so the question is, is the training webinars, or they have to be completed face to face? And so I believe it is all face-to-face training. And
it is, yeah.
And how it works is that one of the ELLCO trainers typically comes to your location and trains people at your program. That's correct, right, Louisa?
Yes, and all of the people who are certified to train on the ELLCO have all been trained by me, actually. So I've done a few the trainer sessions where I've had groups, people come who want to learn how to train others on the ELLCO. So they've all received ELLCO training from me, as well as additional training on how to train others.
Okay, and we can have, to the person who asked the question, we can have Carolyn from our Brooks on Location program send you some more information about ELLCO training. We have another question. Is ELLCO appropriate for professional development and a peer coaching model?
Absolutely. I think that like as I mentioned in the user's guide to the tool, there is a whole chapter devoted to professional development, and talks specifically, gives it some guidance about the best way to do so, advice such as previewing the tool with the classroom teacher before using it, and using how to have the teacher use the tool for self-reflection. So it is widely used for professional development and by coaches.
Okay. And can the ELLCO be used along with other tools like the class or the ECKERs that are sometimes used for professional development?
It certainly can. I think I would caution, I know that I think that it's in some ways a very good complement to those other tools, because it does look much more in depth at language and literacy, environment, and instruction. It is scored differently from both of those tools, so I think that in addition to receiving training on the ELLCO, it would require some moving back and forth in terms of how you think about scoring. So it would take a sophisticated user to be able to use these tools, because they are used differently. I mentioned before that the ECKERS is much more of a checklist approach. So and whereas the ELLCO is holistic scoring. It certainly can be used at the same time, but it needs to be used by someone who understands the differences between the tools and is comfortable with shifting back and forth.
Right, that makes sense. We have a question about the cello. Could you speak a little bit about the cello? How is it the same or different?
To be honest, I have looked through the cello. I have not used the cello, so I know that it is designed specifically for use in home-based settings. I think that some of the items are similar. The structure is similar. It has the the 5-point rating scale, the anchor statement, the descriptive indicators, and some of the items in terms of organization and things like that are similar. But I don't know it all that in depth, but I know that there are probably other folks at Brooks who could speak more specifically to the differences.
Yes, we can send some information to the person who asked that question. And I know on our website we also have there's a landing page about the cello. So if you go to the Brooks website, we have a whole section on screening and assessment, and each of our tools have a page, and so the Cello does have a page. And I can send that link out after the webinar. Let's see, I'm just scrolling through the questions here to make sure. Okay, I think we have one more. So will you describe, this question's about the teacher interview. So can you describe the teacher interview that's part of the observation?
Yes, so the teacher interview is, what we try to do is, so the tool itself is designed to be used to be very much a observation tool. So the items, we try to gather as much of the information as possible just from what we observe. There is the teacher interview that is really, I would say, much more useful in terms of professional development because it asks teachers about their goals and different strategies that they've used. But what we do caution, especially folks who are using the tool for research, is that the scores that are assigned for each of the items should come from what is observed in the classroom and not from what the teacher shares in the teacher interview. So if there is conflicting information from the interview as opposed to what was seen, that we always stress the importance of going with what was observed.
Okay. So we have a question about the descriptive indicators. Are there definitions provided for terms such as appealing to minimize subjectiveness? And I'm sure some of that's probably covered in the training.
That is covered in the training, and it's also, I think, one of the reasons why you need to have someone who is familiar with early childhood classrooms and has seen a range, which is why we talk about observation experience. So someone who's seen a range of classrooms and someone who knows early childhood. But we do have, in the training, there are videos that we use to do the training, so I think that helps people get a sense of how the tool is used and how that works.
Okay, great. And then we did have another question, a follow-up question about the training. So is the training 1 day of training?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, and then I think, well, we had just one more question. So Louisa, if you could just, I guess this person, when they registered, had a question about the ways it can be used to improve programs. I know you talked a little bit about the professional development where you could use certain items, but maybe if you just could talk a little bit briefly about how some programs have used it.
So for within the program, I think that again, so previewing it, having people aware of what the tool is structured, what it looks for. Those 5 rating levels and descriptive indicators also serve as a good illustration of best practice. So reviewing with teachers or people in the program what what is a 5 for organization of the classroom. Let's talk through these descriptive indicators and think about what this might look like, and then also think about where realistically and objectively, where do we as a program fall on each of these particular items. So having that kind of conversation and then actually having somebody, whether it's the program director or if they hire a consultant to get to have someone come in and use the ELLCO and then share those findings and look again at where the program scored highly and where there are areas for improvement, and then using those descriptive indicators at the higher levels to make a plan for how to get to a higher level.
Great. I think that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we do have one more question coming in, which is great. How do you ensure that a classroom will be conducting activities as usual on the day of the observation?
That's a good question, actually. So we talk about this in the training, and I think it's also in the user's guide, but certainly don't want to just show up and surprise a teacher in terms of doing an ELLCO. So scheduling with the teacher and finding out in advance, stressing that you want to see a typical day of instruction, and finding out a rough idea of the classroom schedule, so that you can be sure to be there during those important times that I mentioned earlier, making sure you're there for book reading and things like that. And making sure that you're not, I know it happened to me once where I went to do a schedule observation and it happened to be school picture day. So it was really not the ideal time when you're trying to keep all these preschoolers from getting dirty. It wasn't
Right.
really a typical situation. So even the best laid plans can not turn out the way you hoped, but communicating with the teacher and stressing what it is that you want to see and asking that you try to that you want to see as typical a day as possible. And then it can be stressful for teachers because just having you there makes it not a typical day. So trying to reassure the teacher and trying to be as unobtrusive as possible so that the teacher and kids can go about their day.
And one more question about the observations. So do you share the instrument, the ELLCO instrument, with the teachers in advance before you go in?
I think it depends on what you're using it for. I think if you're using it for professional development purposes, then I would recommend that. I think it's helpful for teachers to know what it is that the ELLCO is about and how it can be a valuable tool for them. I think if you're using it for research purposes, then you probably don't want them to know exactly what you're looking for because you're trying to answer a specific research question and not have it be influenced by the tool.
Great. Okay, so I think that was the last of the questions that were submitted. So Louisa, I'd just like to really thank you for presenting the webinar, and thanks to everyone who listened in, and you'll be getting, as I mentioned in the beginning, an email tomorrow with a recording. So feel free, if you have other people in your program that you think might be interested in watching it, feel free to forward on that email to them. And we appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, bye-bye.